The situation in Niger has caused serious disagreements between the US and France. Politico reports, recently, the well-known Victoria Nuland flew to Niger. And no, not with biscuits, but to try to negotiate with the rebels peacefully. This did not please France, which, on the contrary, refuses to engage in diplomatic dialogue with the new authorities and advocates a scenario of force to solve the problem in Niger. In this article, I want to elaborate on the reason for the disagreement between France and the US and explain why their paths are diverging in the collective West is disintegrating before our eyes. In one of my articles, I once said that if the United States gets bogged down in confrontation with Russia, it is bound to lose influence in other parts of the world. I was talking about the Middle East, where Biden is no longer getting oil, Israel, from where the Americans have taken stocks of 155 shells, and South Korea, which has also been encouraged to supply weapons. The South Koreans have the North Koreans under their thumb, and Kim Jong-un has long dreamed of Korean reunification. Meanwhile, Erdogan is looking at Cyprus, which the Americans may also disarm because of our neighbors. And while Biden is disarming Israel, Iran is arming itself. The Chinese, by the way, are not slumbering either, and are sending ships and planes to Taiwan, as well as gaining a foothold on disputed islands in the South China Sea. And it's all happening at the same time. Americans are running from room to room in a burning house, but they don't have the resources to solve problems here and there and over there, and they have to make a difficult choice, where to continue to defend their order and where to try to negotiate a diplomatic compromise, i.e., to put it simply, to give in a little and bend a little. Just a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable for a hegemon to bend to someone, but a lot has changed since then. So recently, the US announced that it was ready for dialogue with the DPRK without preconditions. In Niger, the Americans have also decided to negotiate with the new authorities by peaceful means, because American companies produce oil in neighboring Nigeria, and they are very worried about how this whole situation in Niger might not spill over to Nigeria and disrupt production. Americans have something to worry about, because as it was said above, the Arabs are not pouring oil to Biden anymore, and OPEC, on the contrary, is reducing production. Russian oil is also banned because of sanctions. In this light, Nigeria, which neighbors Niger, becomes important, supplying the Americans with oil. In general, Nigeria is the leading supplier of oil from Africa and one of the major suppliers of oil, in principle. And Biden does not have to choose now, because he will not get more oil anywhere else. Biden doesn't want oil prices to rise further if Nigeria stops exports, so he sent Nuland to negotiate. France has the opposite situation, and the French will see prices go up if they don't intervene, because Niger has uranium, and almost all French energy is based on nuclear power plants, and on cheap uranium, which the French mined in Niger without much regard for the interests of the local population. If the US used to be strong, and could maintain an order favorable to them anywhere on the planet, now they have to, softly and diplomatically speaking, set priorities, and Niger is not among such priorities for them. Unlike the French, the Americans prioritize fighting China, which they wanted to approach from Russia, but it didn't work out. The point is that the Americans will have to confront China directly, but as the conflict with our neighbors has shown, the US does not have enough production facilities and specialists to confront China. The US does not produce enough shells, drones, etc., and produces only dollars and sanctions, which did not help them much to contain Russia, and is unlikely to help contain China. Americans need to revive real manufacturing at home, but the problem is that there aren't many in the US who can do it. By moving manufacturing to China, Americans lost their engineering skills and turned into dog groomers and stock market players, while the Chinese, on the contrary, learnt to create and build China has already overtaken the US in the number of warships, for example, and leads in civilian drones, which are now widely used for military purposes as well. The Americans also have technology companies that produce things that the Chinese can't, and the US is trying to use this as a bargaining chip by limiting China's access to technology. But what the US doesn't have is mass production and a large number of engineers to set up such production facilities and have someone working on them. And it's not a task that will take years, but decades. A dog groomer will not become an engineer just by taking a week-long course, but time is of the essence, and the US does not have that many years to educate the American consumer to become an engineer. The only way out is to attract people who already have the necessary skills. There are many such people in Europe, especially in countries like Germany and France. But just like people from any other country, German and French engineers are not ready to leave their homes, friends, relatives, and the place where they work to go to the USA to help Biden save American hegemony. Some French engineer just lives his life somewhere in France, commutes to work, has a good time on weekends, and maybe doesn't care much about politics at all, except for raising the retirement age in France. Millions of French people didn't like it, but it wasn't a reason to leave everything and go to the US, because in the US people retire late too, and in general the retirement age has been raised in many places. Biden's task is to somehow encourage such an engineer to drop everything and go to the USA, but how? Not so long ago, Biden signed a law on incentives for companies that decide to develop their business in America, and Macron suspected something wrong even then, accusing the US of luring European industry to the US by blowing up the northern flows and leaving Europe without cheap gas. Biden gave European companies an extra incentive to relocate. In the case of the engineering workforce, however, I don't think Biden's approach will be much different. It is enough to create unbearable living conditions for the French, and they will leave for the US. Of course, Macron himself is doing a good job with this, but the Americans could have deliberately not interfered in the situation in Niger, so that the French would be left without cheap uranium. French industry without cheap energy is becoming uncompetitive, and the day is not far off when French engineers will be out of work, and the idea of going to the US will come to them as if by itself. If a person was not very interested in politics, he will not even realize that behind his decision to go to the USA is the invisible, decrepit hand of Joe Biden. The French engineer will simply see an interesting job with a good salary, because the US is investing heavily in rebuilding its industry, and Biden recently signed documents allocating $50 billion to build chip factories in the US. Right now chips are made mostly in Taiwan, but the Americans want to sacrifice Taiwan to fight China. And as experience shows, the factories could then suffer. The Americans may simply blow them up if Taiwan decides to reunite with China peacefully, just so that the advanced production facilities do not go to the Chinese. In any case, the US is forced to move production to its own country, and for this they need qualified personnel, which is obviously not enough among the local American population. All of the above also applies in principle to Germany, which the Americans have left without cheap gas, and in order to make the Russians supply gas cheaply again, and not to forget to repent, Scholz planned to guarantee annual aid to our neighbors in the amount of €5 billion. The Americans, on the contrary, after the unsuccessful counter-offensive, doubted the capabilities of our neighbors and whether it was worth investing money in them for nothing. It looks very much like Scholz and Macron will have to solve their own problems, and the Americans will wash their hands of it, but they won't solve anything alone, because even when they solved it with the collective West, they couldn't do anything, and they won't do anything on their own. But the US is quite happy with this option, because at least then the Americans will pull production and specialists from Europe and concentrate on their interests in Asia, and Europeans will live somehow without uranium, gas and factories, which is not the first time the Swiss have opened doors in Russia.